The morning air was crisp, with the sun peeking through the pine trees as James pulled the car to a stop at the gravel driveway of the company retreat center. The sign above the gate read, Sycamore Pines Corporate Campground, its rustic charm doing little to ease the strange knot forming in his stomach. Clara, his wife of 10 years, sat beside him in the passenger seat, her polished nails tapping rhythmically against her phone screen. Team building, she had said when she first mentioned the retreat weeks ago, her voice laced with excitement. It's just a weekend of bonding with my coworkers. Alex thinks it'll help us all connect better. Alex, the name hung in the air like a bad aftertaste. Alex was her boss, the charismatic CEO everyone in her office admired. Tall, confident, and exuding the kind of effortless charm that made people hang on his every word. James had never met the man, but he'd heard enough stories to form an image. A powerful figure who walked into a room and owned it. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Are you sure you packed everything?" he asked, his voice tinged with something he couldn't quite name. Worry? Insecurity? Clara glanced up from her phone, flashing him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, James. It's just a couple of days. Don't worry so much." He watched her step out of the car, her sleek black boots crunching against the gravel. She looked radiant. Too radiant, he thought with a pang. Her hair fell perfectly over her shoulders, and her tailored coat hugged her figure in a way that felt less like a practical choice for the woods and more like an intentional statement. Clara had always been beautiful, but lately, it seemed like she was trying harder than usual. For whom? He wondered. As James helped unload her suitcase, his gaze wandered to a group of people gathered near the retreat's entrance. Among them stood a man who had to be Alex. Even from a distance, the CEO commanded attention, laughing heartily with a small circle of employees. His presence was magnetic, the kind that made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. Clara's face lit up when she spotted him. James swallowed hard. "I'll pick you up Sunday evening," he said, his voice quieter now. Clara turned to him, leaning in to plant a quick kiss on his cheek. Felt rehearsed, hollow. "Thanks, hon. Love you." But before she turned away, James caught it, that glance. Clara's eyes flicked toward Alex, her expression softening in a way that made James' chest tighten. It wasn't long, just a fleeting moment, but it was enough. Enough to stir something deep and primal within him. He clenched his fists, watching as she walked toward the group, suitcase in tow. "I told myself I was overthinking," James muttered under his breath as he got back into the car, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. But the way she looked at him, something wasn't right. As the car rumbled down the winding road away from the retreat, James couldn't shake the image from his mind. Clara's glance, Alex's laughter, and the inexplicable feeling that this weekend was about more than team building. It was the first crack in the foundation of a life he thought was unshakable. A crack that would soon split wide open. And deep down, he knew. He just didn't want to admit it yet. The soft hum of the coffee machine filled the kitchen as James stood by the counter, staring into the amber swirl of his cup. The house felt eerily quiet, as if Clara's absence had drained it of its usual warmth. He glanced at the framed photo on the wall, a candid shot of them laughing during a beach vacation 2 summers ago. Her eyes sparkled with happiness, and his arm rested protectively around her shoulders. It was a picture of a life that seemed so complete, so untouchable. James sighed, shaking off the unease from the retreat drop-off. Clara had always been the ambitious one, striving for success in ways that sometimes felt foreign to him. She thrived in her corporate world of sleek suits and power lunches, while he found contentment in the steady rhythm of his carpentry business. His days were simple but fulfilling, building custom furniture, solving problems with his hands. Clara often joked that he was her rock, grounding her in a world that sometimes felt too fast-paced. Their life together was built on routines. Weeknight dinners, long walks with their golden retriever, Daisy, and Sunday mornings spent reading the paper over coffee. They'd even started talking about having children. James remembered the conversation vividly. Clara sitting across from him, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "I think I'm ready," she'd said softly, her voice carrying both excitement and apprehension. "What do you think?" "I think you'd be an amazing mom," he'd replied, his heart swelling at the thought of their future. It had felt like a promise, a shared dream they were finally ready to pursue. But lately something had changed. Clara had been more distracted, her phone always within reach, buzzing with notifications. She'd started spending more time at the office, her once bright eyes now shadowed with something James couldn't quite place. He chalked it up to work stress. Her role had grown more demanding since Alex had taken over as CEO. Alex. His name surfaced again, uninvited, like a splinter James couldn't ignore. Clara spoke of him often, always with a mix of admiration and awe. "He's just so visionary," she'd said one evening, her voice carrying a spark that James hadn't heard in a while. "He sees potential in people and pushes them to be their best." James hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, in the stillness of their kitchen, those words felt heavier. The way she'd said potential lingered in his mind, as if it held a meaning he hadn't fully grasped. He tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the mundane tasks of the day. But they kept creeping back, little details that didn't sit right. The way Clara had packed her favorite perfume for a weekend in the woods. The extra care she'd taken with her hair and makeup that morning. The faint hesitation in her voice when she kissed him goodbye. By the time evening rolled around, James found himself in his workshop, sanding the edge of a cherry wood table. The repetitive motion usually calmed his mind, but tonight it did little to quiet the gnawing unease. His phone buzzed on the workbench, a text from Clara. "Having a great time. Hope your day was good too. Love you." The words were simple, but James lingered on them. She always texted him when she was away, but this felt different. There was a distance in her tone, a formality that didn't belong between them. He stared at the message for a long time, debating whether to reply. Finally, he typed back, "Miss you. Can't wait to have you home." But as he hit send, a question lingered in the back of his mind. Does she miss me too? That night, James lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the house silent except for the faint rustle of leaves outside the window. He thought about their life, the plans they'd made, the laughter they'd shared. It was a life he'd always believed was solid, built on love and trust. But now, cracks were forming, small, almost imperceptible cracks that threatened to widen into something much larger. And for the first time, James allowed himself to wonder, what if I'm losing her? The thought sent a chill through him, settling deep in his chest. He closed his eyes, trying to will himself to sleep, but the image of Clara's glance at Alex haunted him. The perfect picture of their life together was no longer as clear as it once seemed. The Sunday evening sun dipped low in the sky, casting warm orange hues over the driveway as James parked the car. Clara's retreat was over, and he had been waiting for this moment. Partly to feel the relief of having her back home, partly to quell the gnawing doubts that had grown louder with each passing day. When Clara emerged from the retreat center, she looked radiant, as if she had spent the weekend at a spa rather than a corporate camp in the woods. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes sparkling with a vibrancy James hadn't seen in years. She walked toward him with a buoyancy in her step, her laughter ringing out as she exchanged farewells with her coworkers. Among them was Alex, standing tall and magnetic as always, commanding attention without effort. James forced a smile as Clara slid into the passenger seat. "Looks like you had a good time," he said, his voice steady despite the unease bubbling beneath the surface. "It was amazing," Clara replied, her tone effervescent. "Alex organized everything perfectly. He even arranged this surprise outdoor dinner by the lake. It was magical." She paused, her eyes softening. "I mean, for the team, of course." James nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he pulled out of the parking lot. "Sounds like he's quite the boss." "Oh, he is," Clara said, her enthusiasm spilling over. "He just has this way of making everyone feel special, like they matter. It's inspiring." The drive home was filled with Clara's stories of the retreat, team-building exercises, late-night bonfires, group hikes. But as she talked, James noticed how often Alex's name came up, like a refrain he couldn't escape. By the time they pulled into the driveway, James felt suffocated by her words, though he didn't dare say so. Later that evening, after Clara had gone to shower, James sat alone in the living room scrolling through social media. He had hoped to distract himself, but instead, he stumbled upon a photo that made his heart sink. It was a group shot from the retreat, posted by one of Clara's co-workers. Everyone stood by the lake, smiling and relaxed, but his eyes were drawn immediately to Clara. She stood next to Alex, his arm draped casually over her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, seemingly innocent to anyone else, but James saw something more. The way Alex's hand lingered, the ease in Clara's posture as she leaned slightly toward him. It felt intimate, too intimate for co-workers. "It's just a hand," James muttered to himself, but the words felt hollow. The image said everything he didn't want to believe. When Clara came back downstairs, her hair damp and her skin glowing, James couldn't bring himself to confront her. Instead, he showed her the photo, forcing his voice to remain casual. "Looks like everyone had a great time." Clara glanced at the screen and smiled. "Oh, that. Yeah, it was right after the dinner. We were all so relaxed." James nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. "You and Alex seem close." Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. "He's just friendly, James. You know how team-building things are, it's all about bonding." Bonding. The word hung in the air, suffocating him. He wanted to press her, to ask if there was more to the way she spoke about Alex, to the glow that seemed to linger on her skin. But instead, he smiled weakly and let it go. That night, as Clara drifted off to sleep beside him, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of Alex's hand on her shoulder replayed in his mind, over and over, until it burned like a brand. The cracks in their life were no longer small. They were widening, and James could feel it deep in his bones. Something was wrong, something he couldn't ignore. And as the house fell silent, he realized for the first time that the life he thought he knew, the woman he thought he knew, might already be slipping away. The late afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window as James stood by the sink, absent-mindedly sorting through a pile of laundry. Clara had left her work clothes bundled in the hamper, an unusual oversight for someone as meticulous as her. He pulled out her silk blouse, still faintly carrying the scent of her perfume, and shook his head. "Busy," he muttered to himself. "She's just been busy." As he reached deeper into the pile, his hand brushed against a soft fabric. It was the scarf Clara had claimed she'd lost at the retreat, a vibrant red one he had given her on their anniversary years ago. His brow furrowed as he held it up, memories of her laughter when she first wrapped it around herself flashing in his mind. "Strange," he murmured. He started to fold it when something slipped from its folds, fluttering to the floor. It was a small piece of paper, folded neatly, with handwriting he didn't recognize. James froze, his pulse quickening as he bent to pick it up. The words were simple, but they struck like a punch to the gut. "Can't wait to see you again." James stared at the note, his chest tightening. His mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it's from a coworker, he thought, though the tone didn't match a professional relationship. Maybe it's harmless. But deep down, he knew better. That evening, James sat in his workshop, the note resting on the table in front of him like a taunt. He traced the letters with his finger, the loops of the handwriting smooth and deliberate, as if whoever wrote it had taken their time. The A was unmistakable. Alex. His hands shook as he reached for Clara's phone, which she had left charging on the counter. He had never felt the need to go through her things before, but tonight, the suspicion gnawed at him relentlessly. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, but then unlocked it with a deep breath. The messages were there, subtle at first. Texts from Alex about meetings and project updates, all innocuous. But as he scrolled further back, his stomach churned. "Alex. Dinner by the lake was incredible. You looked stunning under the stars." "Clara. It was such a special night. Thank you for everything." James's breath hitched. The messages weren't overtly incriminating, but they carried a familiarity that didn't belong in a professional relationship. A sharp pang of betrayal coursed through him as he continued reading. The final text stopped him cold. Alex, I'll find any excuse to have you on the next retreat. Can't wait to steal another moment with you. James's vision blurred with rage. His hand clenched the phone so tightly he feared it might shatter. How long had this been going on? The pieces began to fall into place. The late nights, the glowing admiration in her voice when she spoke about Alex, the way she seemed to drift further away with each passing day. Later that night, Clara sat in the living room, scrolling through her tablet, while James remained in the kitchen, the note tucked in his pocket. He watched her from the doorway, the woman he had loved for over a decade now feeling like a stranger. The red scarf was draped over the back of a chair, a silent reminder of everything he was starting to lose. Clara, he finally said, his voice steady but cold. Did you ever find your scarf? She glanced up, her expression momentarily startled. Oh yeah, it must have been in my bag the whole time. Funny, right? James didn't reply. He nodded slowly, the weight of her lie sinking deeper into his chest. As Clara returned to her screen, oblivious to the storm brewing within him, James slipped into their bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed, the note crumpled in his fist. The cracks in their life had become chasms, and the betrayal he had feared was no longer just a shadow in his mind. It was real, undeniable, and it was tearing him apart. For the first time, James allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was happening. The woman he had trusted, the life they had built together, was slipping through his fingers. And as the night deepened, so did his resolve. If Clara and Alex thought they could play him for a fool, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The night air was crisp, and the moon hung low, casting a pale glow over the quiet suburban streets. James's truck idled a block away from the office building, where Clara had claimed she was working late. His heart pounded as he sat gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had followed her discreetly earlier in the evening, waiting for her to emerge. When she finally did, she wasn't alone. Alex walked beside her, his hand lightly brushing her back as they made their way to his sleek black car. James clenched his teeth, his stomach twisting as they drove off into the night. He followed at a safe distance, his truck blending into the sparse traffic. The car turned into a small private airstrip, the kind reserved for people with power and money. James parked outside the gate, watching as Alex's car disappeared down the illuminated runway. He slipped out of his truck, the cool night air biting against his skin as he scaled the fence with a resolve he didn't know he possessed. James crept closer, keeping to the shadows, until he spotted them. Alex's private jet loomed in the background, its engines humming softly. Clara stood at the base of the stairs, her face lit up in a way James hadn't seen in years. Alex stood beside her, leaning in close, his hand resting on her waist as he whispered something that made her laugh. The sight was like a dagger to James's heart. He stepped out of the shadows, his boots crunching against the gravel. Clara! His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet night. Clara froze, her laughter dying on her lips. She turned slowly, her face a mixture of shock and guilt. Alex straightened, his confident smirk faltering as he took in James's furious expression. "What are you doing here?" Clara stammered, taking a step back. James advanced, his eyes never leaving hers. "Is this your idea of team building, Clara? Or just building a new life without me?" Clara's face hardened, the guilt replaced by defiance. "James, you'll never understand," she said, her voice low but firm. "This is the life I deserve." James's chest tightened, the finality of her words striking like a hammer. He turned his attention to Alex, who stood silently, his hands tucked casually in his pockets as if he had nothing to fear. "And you," James growled, stepping closer to the CEO. "You think you can just take whatever you want, don't you?" Alex smirked, his confidence returning. "I didn't take anything, James. Clara made her choice." "Choice?" James's voice cracked with anger. "You don't know the first thing about loyalty or respect. You think money and charm give you the right to destroy lives." Alex chuckled, a low, condescending sound that made James's blood boil. "I didn't destroy anything, James. Your marriage was already falling apart. I just expedited the process." James lunged forward, his fists clenched, but Clara stepped between them, her hands on James's chest. "Stop it," she cried. "This isn't who you are." James looked down at her, his heart breaking all over again. "You're right, Clara," he said, his voice trembling. "This isn't who I am. But it's who I've had to become, thanks to you." He stepped back, his gaze shifting between Clara and Alex. The sight of them together, the betrayal etched so clearly in every gesture and word, was almost too much to bear. "I hope he's worth it," James said finally, his voice hollow, "because you just threw away everything we built together." Without waiting for a response, James turned and walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of what he had lost. The roar of the jet engines behind him was a cruel reminder of the life Clara was choosing, a life without him. As he climbed back into his truck, James allowed himself a moment of raw emotion, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The tears came then, hot and unrelenting, but so did something else, a simmering resolve. If Alex thought this was over, he was wrong. If Clara believed she could leave without consequences, she underestimated him. James wasn't just walking away. He was planning his next move. Because some battles aren't fought with fists or words. Some battles are fought with strategy, patience, and an unyielding will to take back control. And James was just getting started. The light of dawn filtered through James's workshop as he sat hunched over his laptop, his coffee growing cold beside him. Clara's betrayal still burned in his chest, but it was no longer a chaotic fire. It had become something controlled, focused, fuel for the plan forming in his mind. He wasn't going to let Alex walk away unscathed. This wasn't just about his marriage anymore. It was about taking back his dignity, his life. And if Alex thought his wealth and charm made him untouchable, James was about to prove otherwise. James began with the tools he knew best: meticulous attention to detail and an unshakable resolve. He spent hours combing through Alex's public presence. Press articles, interviews, social media posts, and company reports. The man had built his empire on the illusion of perfection, but James knew every empire had cracks. It wasn't long before he found his first lead. An anonymous blog post from a former employee hinted at a toxic work environment under Alex's leadership. Words like intimidation, manipulation, and harassment leapt off the page. It was vague but enough to start pulling at threads. James reached out to the author through the blog's contact form, his message simple yet earnest. "I understand your pain. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. I'm working to expose Alex for who he truly is. Please reply." 3 days later, James received a reply. The author was a former marketing director named Hannah, who had left Alex's company under suspicious circumstances. They arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Hannah was wary at first, her eyes darting around the room as she spoke. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "What's your angle?" James leaned forward, his voice steady. "Alex destroyed my marriage. He's used his power to manipulate and take from people who trusted him. I want to make sure he doesn't do it again." Hannah studied him for a long moment before nodding. "He's not as untouchable as he thinks," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "Here's everything I've been holding on to: emails, reports, and a few statements from other employees. It's not enough to bring him down, but it's a start." As James flipped through the documents, his resolve hardened. There were complaints of harassment swept under the rug, shady financial dealings disguised as business expenses, and a pattern of silencing dissent with ironclad non-disclosure agreements. It was more than a start, it was a roadmap. James spent the next few weeks methodically building his case. He cross-referenced Hannah's documents with public records and interviewed other former employees willing to speak off the record. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of Alex's corruption. One night, as James pored over a spreadsheet detailing questionable wire transfers, an idea struck him. He didn't just want to expose Alex's wrongdoing. He wanted to ruin him in the court of public opinion. Using his woodworking contacts, James reached out to a friend in media, a local journalist named Carla who specialized in corporate exposés. Over coffee, he laid out the evidence, careful to protect his sources. Carla whistled low, her eyes scanning the files. "This is gold," she said. "If half of this checks out, Alex's empire is going to crumble." The trap was set. Carla published her article under the headline, "The CEO's Dark Secret, Harassment, Kickbacks, and a Culture of Fear." The story spread like wildfire, picked up by national outlets and igniting a social media storm. Employees past and present came forward, emboldened by the article, sharing their own stories of Alex's abuse of power. Investors began pulling out, and the company's stock plummeted. James watched it all unfold from his workshop, his hands steady as he sanded a piece of oak. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of calm. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about justice. Alex had underestimated him, and now he was paying the price. But James wasn't done yet. He had one more card to play, one that would bring Alex and Clara face to face with the consequences of their actions. And this time, there would be no escaping the fallout. The morning was quiet, almost serene, as James sat in his workshop. He had waited weeks for this moment, meticulously piecing together every detail, every fragment of evidence. The storm he had unleashed against Alex's empire was only the beginning. Today, his carefully laid plans would reach their crescendo. James sent an anonymous email to the SEC and local authorities, attaching meticulously organized files of Alex's financial misconduct. Each transaction was tied to shady kickbacks and offshore accounts. Within hours, regulators launched a formal investigation, freezing Alex's assets and subpoenaing his company's records. Simultaneously, James shared a separate file with Carla. This one was different. It detailed personal accounts of Alex's inappropriate relationships with several employees. The file also included photographs James had anonymously received from Hannah. Pictures of Alex at lavish retreats with women who were clearly more than just co-workers. Carla released her second exposé, this one titled, "Behind Closed Doors: The Personal Scandals of a CEO." The article went viral instantly. Social media exploded with hashtags condemning Alex, and the media camped outside his company's headquarters. Former employees continued to come forward, adding fuel to the growing fire. That evening, James composed a new email. This time, it was addressed to Clara. The subject line read, "For your eyes only." Inside, he included excerpts from Alex's texts to other women and screenshots of his private moments captured by Hannah's documents. James ended the email with a simple message. "You weren't special. You were just one of many. I thought you deserved to know." When Clara opened the email, her hands trembled. Her carefully constructed fantasy of a glamorous life with Alex shattered as the evidence unfolded before her eyes. The images of Alex laughing intimately with other women, the texts that mirrored the ones he had sent her. It all painted a picture she could no longer deny. Clara spent the rest of the night trying to call Alex, but he didn't pick up. He was too busy dealing with the fallout. The company's next retreat was already planned, ironically themed as a celebration of team unity and resilience. Alex had insisted on going forward with it, believing he could weather the storm. Clara attended as well, desperate to salvage what remained of her illusion. James, however, had ensured this would be no ordinary retreat. As the team gathered in the grand hall of the luxury resort, Alex stood at the podium, his charm slightly diminished but his arrogance intact. Just as he began his speech, a group of men in dark suits entered the room, followed by uniformed officers. Alexander Graves, one of them announced, his voice firm, "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion." Gasps echoed through the room as Alex froze, his confident facade crumbling. Cameras flashed, and phones recorded every second as officers handcuffed him and led him away. The crowd turned to Clara, who stood paralyzed, her face flushed with humiliation. Whispers spread like wildfire. Wasn't she involved with him? Did she know? Unable to withstand the stares, Clara fled the room, tears streaming down her face. Back in his workshop, James watched the live news coverage on his laptop. He had remained in the background, orchestrating events from afar. The sight of Alex being led away in handcuffs was satisfying, but it wasn't the arrest that brought him peace. It was knowing that he had taken back control, not just of the situation but of his life. Clara's phone rang that night. It was James. For the first time since the confrontation at the airstrip, she answered. "James, she began, her voice shaky. "Don't," he interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "Whatever you were going to say, it doesn't matter anymore. I just wanted you to know that I see things clearly now. I'm moving on, Clara. I suggest you do the same." He hung up, leaving her to sit alone in the silence of her shattered world. The fallout from the retreat was swift and merciless. Alex's company collapsed under the weight of investigations and public outrage. Clara, now unemployed and disgraced, disappeared from social circles she once cherished. As for James, he returned to his quiet life, finding solace in his work and the company of close friends. He wasn't the same man he had been. He was stronger, more resolute, and determined to build a future on his own terms. Some battles aren't fought with fists or words, but with patience, strategy, and an unwavering sense of justice. And James had won his. The workshop was unusually quiet that morning. James sat at his workbench, staring at a piece of oak he couldn't bring himself to touch. His plan had succeeded beyond his expectations, yet the triumph felt hollow. As the dust settled, unexpected ripples from his actions began to emerge. James's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was Carla. Her name had become synonymous with his victory, but today her tone was far from celebratory. "You should know, James," she began, her voice subdued. "The fallout from Alex's arrest is hitting hard. A lot of employees are losing their jobs. The company's board announced massive layoffs this morning." James tightened his grip on the phone. "They're innocent," he said, more to himself than to Carla. "They are," Carla agreed. "But when a company collapses, it's not just the guilty who suffer. People are furious. Some are even blaming the whistleblowers." The words struck James like a hammer. He had justified his actions by focusing on Alex and Clara, but he hadn't considered the collateral damage, the livelihoods of people who had nothing to do with the betrayal that consumed him. "Thanks for letting me know," he said, ending the call. He sat in silence, the weight of unintended consequences pressing down on him. Later that evening, James heard a knock at his door. When he opened it, Clara stood on the porch, her once perfect composure now a shadow of itself. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she clutched a small bag. "James," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where else to go." James crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here, Clara?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I made a mistake. Alex, he used me. He used everyone. I thought I was special, but I wasn't. You were right about everything." James felt a pang of conflicting emotions. Anger, pity, and an unfamiliar sense of closure. "And now you want what?" he asked, his tone calm but distant. "Forgiveness? A fresh start?" Clara shook her head. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I know that. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. For a moment, James considered letting her in, letting her explain. But then he remembered the countless nights he had spent alone, questioning his worth while she laughed with another man. "I accept your apology," he said finally. "But it doesn't change anything. You made your choice, Clara. Now I'm making mine." She nodded, her shoulders sagging as she turned to leave. "I hope you find happiness, James," she said softly before walking away. After Clara's departure, James poured himself a drink and sat by the fireplace. The flames danced, their warmth doing little to ease the chill that had settled in his chest. Had he gone too far? He had exposed Alex for the fraud he was, but in doing so, he had disrupted countless lives. Was justice worth the collateral damage? He thought of the employees who had spoken to him in confidence, trusting him to expose the truth. People like Hannah, who had risked everything to reveal Alex's corruption. Their stories deserved to be heard, but now they were caught in the fallout. James picked up his phone and dialed Carla again. "I want to help," he said when she answered. "The people who've lost their jobs because of Alex, they deserve support. Maybe we can create a fund or something." Carla paused, her voice softening. "That's a noble idea, James. I'll see what we can do." In the weeks that followed, James worked tirelessly with Carla and a few former employees to establish a support fund for those affected by the layoffs. Donations poured in from individuals who had read Carla's articles and wanted to help. Slowly, the narrative shifted from one of destruction to one of rebuilding. For James, the fund became more than just a way to atone. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was room for redemption. One evening, as he closed the lid on his laptop, James glanced at a photo of himself and Clara on the mantel. He picked it up, studying the image of two people who had once believed in forever. With a resolute sigh, he placed it face down in a drawer. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. And as the first snow of winter fell outside, James allowed himself a rare smile. His life, like the world around him, was ready for a fresh start. The winter sun filtered weakly through the frosted windows of James's workshop, casting a pale glow over his workbench. The familiar scent of sawdust and varnish filled the room, a reminder of the life he was rebuilding. Piece by piece, plank by plank. The fallout for Clara was as swift as it was merciless. Overnight, she became the subject of public scrutiny. Her once pristine reputation as a successful corporate professional was reduced to whispers of complicity and opportunism. Social circles she had carefully curated turned their backs, and the glamorous life she had imagined crumbled like ash in her hands. Clara had to sell the few valuables she had left, including the designer gifts Alex had showered her with, to cover mounting debts. She moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the luxurious home she once shared with James. One evening, as Clara sat in the dim light of her small living room, staring at a photo from their wedding day, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had lost everything: her career, her status, and most painfully, the unwavering loyalty of a man who had once loved her without condition. For Alex, the consequences were even more brutal. His arrest at the retreat was only the beginning. Investigations unearthed years of financial fraud, harassment claims, and unethical business practices. His assets were seized, his board of directors ousted him, and lawsuits piled up faster than his legal team could handle. Public humiliation was swift and unrelenting. The man who once commanded rooms with his charisma was now the face of corporate greed and corruption. Former employees, emboldened by the exposure, testified against him, ensuring that his fall from grace was absolute. The last James heard of Alex, he was facing a lengthy prison sentence. The man who had so confidently declared his invincibility now sat behind bars, forgotten by the world he once ruled. For James, the path forward was quieter, yet deeply fulfilling. He poured himself into his craft, creating custom furniture that quickly gained recognition for its artistry and precision. Orders began to flow in from across the state, and his small business flourished. But it wasn't just his work that transformed. James began to focus on his own well-being. He joined a local hiking group, rediscovered his love for reading, and even enrolled in a photography class. Slowly, he built a life that was his alone, free from the shadows of betrayal and doubt. One crisp Saturday morning, James walked through the park with Daisy, his golden retriever. The air was filled with the laughter of children playing and the distant hum of a coffee cart. James paused to snap a picture of the frozen lake, its surface shimmering under the pale sun. As he lowered his camera, he caught a reflection of himself in the viewfinder. Not the broken man who had once doubted his worth, but someone stronger, more certain. He smiled, feeling a rare sense of peace. That evening, James sat by the fireplace, a journal open on his lap. He had started writing again, a habit he'd abandoned during the turmoil of his marriage. His pen hovered over the page as he thought about the journey he had been on. Finally, he wrote, "I may have lost her, but I found something far more important myself. Life doesn't always go as planned, but sometimes, what we lose makes room for what we need to find." Betrayal taught me resilience. Revenge gave me clarity. And now I can see the man I've become. I'm proud of him. Closing the journal, James leaned back in his chair, the fire casting warm shadows across the room. The battle was over, and though the scars remained, they no longer defined him. He had rebuilt his life on his own terms, and for the first time in years, the future felt bright. Outside, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in quiet, hopeful possibility.